Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, C.G. Wagner. This podcast is an extension of our work at LTS to support survivors of sexual violence with long-term care, community, and resources, all at no cost to participants. This month's episode is a healthy emotional immune system. So, I've been fighting against the sun lately. See, I'm still trying to figure out the sweet spot for my winter garden. If I plant too late, then the first freeze kills the plants that haven't grown big enough. If I plant too early, then I have to fight the sun. Because I lost so many plants to frost last year, I decided to plant early this year. I thought that the relatively mild summer, for Austin at least, was an indication that fall would also be reasonable. But as it turns out, fall has been anything but reasonable. For nearly every day in September and the majority of October, it was in the 90s every day. It hasn't rained a drop since I planted over Labor Day weekend. Over the past few days, the humidity has plummeted to near desert conditions in the afternoons. So, I am fighting against the sun. I have to water multiple times a day to keep my plants alive. A few days ago, when I went to water my plants, I was at the edge of my patience for the whole thing. I had just checked the forecast, and every day for the 10-day forecast was still predicted to be over 90. I could reasonably count on having to water 3 times a day for at least the next week and a half. I felt a lot of annoyance and anger at how this process has been. And then feeling even more annoyed that my options are either to keep doing it and keep the plants alive, or give up and have wasted all that time and energy. I was angry at feeling like I didn't have a choice. And as I was weeding later that day, I'm pretty sure I started glaring at the sun. It was the sun that was making all of this difficult for me. If only the sun would be different, then it would all be okay. But I kept with it, did what I had to do. And once I was back in the AC, I reminded myself that in a few months, when I have vegetables to harvest, I'm going to be so grateful to myself today for sticking with it. And as I sat there thinking about it, I realized that previously the situation would have been a breaking point for me. I would have ended up feeling completely overwhelmed and started crying and then shut down. It would have felt like an unmanageable situation, one that I had to give up on because I simply couldn't handle the emotional toll anymore. I look back over the years of the healing work that I've done, and there isn't one moment that I can clearly pin as when I crossed the threshold of having emotional capacity to navigate normal. The countless therapy sessions, conversations, neuroemotional technique resetting, and more have all built on one another to expand my window of tolerance, and therefore my ability to handle challenging emotional circumstances. In a discussion I was in recently about mental health care, someone pointed out the difference between needing mental health care to treat something specific and participating in mental health care to strengthen one's emotional immune system. And frankly, I loved that concept. For those of us who have endured significant trauma, we need mental health care to recover. And once we walk down the path of recovery, then we get to strengthen our emotional immune system. This is episode 7 of the Survivors Have Paid Enough series, where we explore 8 areas of health and dive into how survivors of sexual violence have all areas of their lives impacted by the trauma they've experienced. We started this series by exploring how mental health is affected by sexual violence and taking a very deep dive into PTSD. We then began unpacking emotional health and dove into how navigating the big emotions and then how to sit with them. For today, we're going to spend less time talking about the why of how a survivor ends up with a weak emotional immune system and spend more time talking about what it looks like to build emotional resistance. So let's quickly touch on the circumstances that lead a survivor to a place where they have diminished emotional capacity. We talk about this much more in depth in our last two episodes, so I won't belabor it here. Essentially, when dealing with a traumatic event, our window of tolerance, so that is to say, what we can handle emotionally and psychologically, shrinks. When we are dealing with ongoing traumas, it continues to shrink until we have almost no capacity left to even manage day in and day out stresses. So, if we are working on building our emotional bandwidth, where do we start? Well, step one is returning to a baseline of emotional health. I've also heard this described as emotional hygiene. And if we are really honest with ourselves, this is not a skill that many people learn or practice intuitively. We need a guide to help us see these things and be able to practice them. Ideally, this happens in childhood with emotionally stable and mature parents or caretakers. For those who don't learn it in childhood, we have the opportunity to learn these lessons from other stable adults and or therapists. As always, if you're not sure where to turn with this, therapy is a great place to start. And that being said, that means that emotional hygiene is not something that is generally on most people's radar. In America, people more or less understand physical, financial, or even intellectual hygiene, even if they don't practice them regularly. But for emotional hygiene, it can feel very ambiguous. So we don't even know what the goal is. So, this is how I have begun to explain good emotional hygiene in 4 steps. Step one, know how you feel. Step two is be able to express what you feel to someone else. Step three is to be attuned to the other person to understand what they feel. And then the last step is to respond to the other person's emotional state in a healthy way. Let's break this down step by step. We're going to start with knowing what you feel. So I dare you to pause this right now and take 30 seconds to figure out what you feel. Go ahead. I can wait. And for most people, this is not an easy first step. If you struggle to identify what you are feeling, I suggest that you find a feelings wheel or a list of feelings to use as a guide. This way, you won't have to manufacture an understanding of what a particular emotion feels like in the body or mind. As you get more practice, you won't need to rely on outside resources as much. I did this for years before I got a solid grasp on how I was feeling. There's another part to this stuff that is key, which is not trying to explain away what you're feeling. There is no need for excuses or explanations or any of that. It is totally and completely fine to recognize that you are feeling angry, scared, or embarrassed, for example. Identifying these things has no moral implications. As I've said before, there's no right or wrong when it comes to emotions. They simply are what they are. Okay, great. You can now understand what you're feeling, like a champ. You've got your handy resources and you're more in touch with yourself. The next step is being able to express what you're feeling to another person. Again, this does not need to be done with an explanation or dismissal of how you're feeling. Saying something like, I am feeling sad right now, is a complete thought in and of itself. You can choose to elaborate if you would like, but it is not a requirement to have to go into details about your inner state to someone else. And for those of us who are in abusive situations, it's also important to make sure that the person you are sharing with is safe and trustworthy. Telling someone that you feel vulnerable if they exploit your vulnerability will only bring you more pain. We'll dive more into that in the next part of this series when we sort through relationship health. But as you're practicing sharing your emotions with safe people, there are times that you will be sharing when you feel very activated and emotionally charged. At all times, but in these moments especially, it is important to differentiate between I am feeling and you made me feel. When you tell someone I am feeling, dot, 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 you are simply sharing your inner state with them. It is a way to connect on a deeper level and feel more understood. It is sharing a part of yourself. And when you say, you made me feel, you've now put someone else in control of your inner state, which is something that they are not in charge of. People may know what buttons to push and what is likely to cause a certain reaction from you. They may know how to elicit a particular response. However, they cannot actually impact your inner state, as much as it feels like that's not the case sometimes. And this is where the healing work lies for a lot of us. We were in regular contact with someone who knew how to push our buttons and elicit a certain response. As we get healthier, as we maintain good boundaries and build emotional resilience, what once caused a reaction no longer does. The deeper the wounds, the longer it takes to not react the same way in the future. You can and will get to the point where those buttons being pushed no longer activate something within you. But I won't lie to you, it takes a significant amount of work to get there. When undoing these patterns with someone who pushed those buttons, maybe hundreds or thousands of times over the years. But back to the original point. There will likely be times that you share how you are feeling with someone using the terminology, I am feeling, and then sharing how you're actually feeling, and the other person takes it as an attack. You are not responsible for how they interact with the information about your emotional state. Only they can control their responses and reactions. You then get to decide how you want to interact with how they reacted to you. Remember, the one thing I would love for you to take away from this look at emotional health, is that emotions are neither good nor bad. They just are. There are no moral implications. Your inner state is just your inner state at that moment in time. It will change, it will shift, it will be different in an hour, in a day, in a year. As we work our way up the steps for emotional hygiene, the next step is being able to read how another person feels. Some people may not be able to express their emotions well if they haven't also done this work. So if they haven't, then you'll need to rely on some context clues. I'm sure most of you have heard this concept that 90 something percent of all communication is nonverbal. That's where this comes into play. What is the person's tone saying? What is their word choice? Their rate of breathing? Are they getting flushed? Are they averting their gaze or keeping eye contact? If you're not sure what you're looking for, there are resources for this as well. You can find charts with nonverbal communication info readily available online. If you need a tool while you practice this skill, they are available. You don't have to figure it all out on your own. The goal here is to be able to understand where the other person is at as they interact with you. Being able to discern someone else's inner state is a challenging next step in a practicing emotional hygiene, but it's one that pays a multitude of dividends once you can do it intuitively. And that's because the final step of emotional hygiene is being able to respond to the other person's emotional state in a healthy way. You may have potentially heard this concept being referred to as creating space for the other person. But essentially, it's being able to recognize and practice that the other person's inner state is theirs and theirs alone. It does not say anything about who you are as a person. Now, of course, the other person's inner state may be in response to something that you did that caused some friction or a break in the connection between you. But this does not give an indication about who you are as a person. It simply gives you information to work off of in order to change behaviors as you need to in order to maintain a healthy connection. You are not responsible for their inner state any more than they are responsible for yours. And it is our joy and our challenge to learn to be emotionally healthy adults who can take ownership of our own inner state without attempting to manage another person's inner state on their behalf. Now, if this all sounds like a lot, it is. None of this is easy work. Whatever step you are on today, you have the opportunity to finely tune that step and even begin to add the challenge of the next one when you have the space for it. It will take intentionality, awareness, and being able to stay present when some incredibly difficult circumstances arise. And this is why I recommend having a therapist help you with this work, specifically an EMDR therapist if you're a survivor. But no matter where you are, practicing good emotional hygiene pays off in ways that you can't even begin to imagine. This is the foundation of strengthening our emotional immune system. You can't have a strong emotional immune system if you are wallowing in filth all the time, whether that's physical or emotional. We know that if we don't practice good physical hygiene, there will be health consequences. We also won't be welcome in social settings. But the problems will keep compounding if we persisted in this lack of hygiene. Why would we think that not practicing good emotional hygiene would be any different? A healthy emotional immune system gets built off of the hygiene. Once we have the hygiene down, we can practice better boundaries, understanding what is mine and what is yours to manage. That builds an even stronger system. And then we'll be able to take on bigger emotional challenges, recognizing that we can get through them with this new resilience we've learned and take even bigger challenges next time. It's a virtuous cycle in which resilience begets more resilience. I know that emotional work often feels like a huge burden with an unclear payoff. It's not always clear that what we're working on has or even will make an impact in our lives. We don't know, though, what we don't experience. It's only clear that it's been useful once we realize that our lives feel much less heavy and burdensome than they once did. We will be able to see the we will be able to see the chances that we took and could manage that we wouldn't have been able to do previously. We can see the moments, like me in my garden, that would have knocked us down before that are now just a small blip on the radar. It allows us to see our own worth and live life in a way that simply states to those around us, this is how I am in the world. I'm not apologizing for that. All of this takes time, specifically working on undoing the trauma and building from there. There is so much potential for a better life when we take these steps, even though they are hard and painful at times. This is what it looks like to hold on to the life you want for yourself. Practice good emotional hygiene, and so many other things will fall into place. Your relationships will change, your physical health will change, and your mental health will change. Even when you don't see others willing to do this work, stick with it. Even when you're not sure if this is pointing you in the direction you want to go, stick with it. Even when you can't be sure this is doing anything at all, stick with it. Remember, do whatever you can to practice good hygiene. You've got this, friends. And thank you for listening to the Louder Than Silence podcast. If you'd like more information about our organization, visit us at louderthansilence.org and sign up for our newsletter, or follow us on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. If you like our work, please consider donating today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. We'll see you next month.